I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate our first session as well as welcome you to our Cloud Migration 101 Summit, brought to you by VMware. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a GoPro Hero 10. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from VMware available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of VMware underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Top 10 Do's and Don'ts of Cloud Migration Planning. This session features Greg Schultz, founder and IT analyst at Server Storage IO. Greg has worked as the customer in various IT organizations in different roles, as well as a vendor, consulting analyst, and author of several books, including Software-Defined Data Infrastructure Essentials from CRC Press. Greg brings a diverse background with real-world perspective across applications, data infrastructures, hardware, software, and cloud. Greg is a Microsoft MVP Cloud Data Center Management and previous 10-time VMware vExpert. Greg, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, great. Thank you, David. Hello, and welcome, everybody, to today's session, Top 10 Do's and Don'ts of Cloud Migration, part of the Cloud Migration 101 Summit. I'm Greg Schultz of Storage IO, and let's get started. And love the fact that today's prize is a Hero 10. I've got one. It is fantastic what you can do with it. Okay, so top 10 do's and don'ts of cloud migration planning. You could read this one list right here, and yeah, you'd be good to go. But let's dig into it. Big one, right off the bat. Do you know what you're doing? Do you know why, where you're going, and how? In other words, do you have a plan when it comes to cloud migration? Do you have a plan? Well, let's go a little deeper into this. So part of having a plan is, where are you currently today on your cloud journey? What are you doing with cloud today? Are you already all in, and your cloud migration is going to be going from Cloud A to Cloud B or Cloud C, or from AWS to Azure to Google or somewhere else? Where are you going? What are you doing? But also, what is that context of that migration? Are you simply going from on-prem, a lift and shift, or a lift and shift? Are you doing from physical machine, bare metal, to virtual machine, from on-prem virtual machine to cloud virtual machine, or containers? There's a lot of different aspects, hence this start-off question. Something that I want to mention here before we go any further is, you'll see these as we go through the deck today, is that over on the right, you'll see that vertical, that stack, the stack layers, areas of focus, different levels of altitude, different perspectives. Across the bottom, think of those as the locations, the platforms, the venues, which could be on-prem, it could be in a public cloud, it could be your private cloud, on-prem at the core or out at the edge. It could be hybrid multi-cloud at a colo, a hosting site. So we have to look at this as a multi-dimensional scenario as we start to go further with our discussion. Okay, so as we go a little bit deeper, we start to see a little bit more in there, the various locations, the platforms, the layers, the focus areas, i.e. that stack. We bring in up there in that upper left, the management aspect, supporting different devices in different locations, whether they be mobile apps, mobile devices, or IoT-type devices. And then we start to look inside the cloud And there are the different resources, server, compute, networking, storage, various services, various operating systems, different platforms that are communicating, but also how those are packaged. They might be in legacy, on-prem supporting a virtualized software-defined type environment, local containers. It might be a hyper-converged infrastructure, an HCI. It might be in the public cloud or across multi-clouds. But we also have something to keep in mind here, the notion of intra-cloud, kind of like the intranet, which is spanning across different disparate clouds, i.e. spanning across AWS and Azure, spanning across Azure and Google. But then inter-cloud. So actually, I just flipped those around. My bad. Inter is like the internet, where we're going across different vendors, different platforms. Intra is when you are going within a given cloud, like within AWS, within your own environment. Think internet as well as intranet, and then put that in perspective. Inter-cloud like internet, across different areas. Intra-cloud like intranet within a given domain. Sorry about that. Anyway, some of the other things you have to keep in perspective are the endpoint protection, authentication, and then some more context is going to come into play here. All right. As a part of the layers, we also have to keep in perspective is that there are the big three, the infrastructure as a service, IaaS, platform as a service, PaaS, PaaS, as well as software as a service, SaaS. So where are you migrating? What are you migrating to? What are the different layers? Are you moving from a traditional in-house database repository and moving that to a platform as a service, a database as a service? Or are you moving, say, desktop to software as a service? Maybe you're moving your Office functionality to O365 or Salesforce or other different aspects. So these are just different things that need to be kept in perspective as a part of the cloud migration conversation. Okay, so with that background out of the way, let's go a little bit more here, which is around that context of the cloud migration and its applicability. All right, so what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that what are you doing? What are you going to do with your cloud migration? Is it simply moving, i.e. lift and shift or lift and shift? Are you simply picking up and moving virtual machines from one place to another, or moving from a physical bare metal machine to a virtual machine and then maybe moving that somewhere else? Are you shifting from one location or a platform to another? Maybe you're going from Hyper-V to VMware, or from VMware to AWS or to Azure or to something else. It's minimal changes, some remediation for compatibility. Maybe you need to convert from a Gen 1 to a Gen 2 or something like that. But that top is a simply pick things up and relocate them. Pick them up and replatform them. The next step is, are you going to be doing a conversion or a refactoring? That you might be going from product A to product B. You might be going from a bare metal to a virtual machine with a little bit more involved. You might be going from a virtual machine to a container. Simply taking your workload and basically stuffing it into a container as opposed to giving it its own virtual machine. So more changes, more updates, maybe some code updates or maybe configuration settings. And as you think of this, as we go from the lift and shift move, relatively easy, pack things up, and off you go, versus the converting, the refactoring, some repackaging, some more work needs to be done before you make those moves. And then we get to a next step, which is the rebuilding, the re-architecting, the rewriting, the reimagining, okay? In other words, go to cloud native, where there's those things that start with R. A lot of different work being done. It's much more involved. It could be more than just simply moving existing workloads from a virtual machine into a container. It could be that complete rewrite, that new deployment of going into a cloud native type environment. All right, so we've got the big three here. which is where the migration context comes into play. And we see a couple scenarios there, which is one up there, center of the top center. One, it might be doing an on-prem physical to a virtual. It might be doing a virtual to a container. Then two might be going from one virtual machine environment to a different virtual machine environment, or going from a Gen 1 virtual machine to a Gen 2, or some other change, some other update that's relatively light, relatively easy. Granted, at scale, things become more complex. We see example of that also in number 2. Number 3 might be doing migrating from either a physical machine, a bare metal machine, or a virtual machine to a public cloud. Number 4 might be moving from what you've had on-prem, a virtual machine, over to a different cloud. And it might be that maybe you're on Windows, where you're moving from a physical Windows to a virtual machine. It might be where you're moving from, say, a Windows to a Hyper-V, or a Windows to a VMware, and that then you're moving from that on-prem Hyper-V or VMware to a cloud-based Hyper-V or VMware as examples. A lot of different permutations here, a lot of different variations. So then we just see some different scenarios where you may be going from one cloud to another, where you might be going across different cloud regions, just a lot of different variations, permutations. And then it might also be where you're simply going cloud native, which is a lot more work level going on. So again, context comes into play. Some will say that a cloud migration is not a cloud migration unless you're doing a cloud native. Okay, well, for some, that is the definition for those that take that viewpoint. For everybody else, there's a lot of other permutations, a lot of different options. All right, so let's move on from there, and let's talk about don't migrate without knowing your environment. And that's from a full stack layers, which means also understanding the different dependencies. So what does that mean? All right, so what are you moving? What are you converting? What are you migrating? We talked about that context a few moments ago, but there is the different layers, those different altitudes at different parts of the stack. Are you just moving something like the virtual desktop or the desktop as a service or Office functionalities? Are you just simply moving those to a PaaS or to a SaaS layer? Are you just simply moving different applications? Are you simply moving your databases, your repositories, your SQLs, your NoSQL from a dedicated server on a virtual machine to a platform as a service or a database as a service? Are you moving or migrating or converting your management tools or your underlying virtual machine? So what is it that you're asked as we look at the higher end of that stack and work our way down? What are the different apps? What are the different workloads? What's being used? How are they being used? What are their resource requirements for compute, for network, for storage, from a performance, from a capacity standpoint, from a service level? And what are the different dependencies? Dependencies on the resources. Are there any hardware dependencies, software dependencies, versions, different things like that as a part of this migration? What about the APIs? What about the SDKs? What about your in-house management tools and scripts? Where are they at? What do you need to do? So this comes back to this idea of knowing what you have, what the requirements, but don't migrate without knowing your resource requirements, your needs, but also the cost. So it might be that you need this amount of compute, this amount of memory, this amount of storage capacity, that it might mean that you have requirements on networking, on endpoints, on bandwidth, whatever it might be. But that know what those are, know what your costs are, so that you can start to build out what it is that you're going to do. So we did a couple of do's. We just did a couple of don'ts. Let's go back to a couple of do items. In other words, what to do. Okay. So having said that, do have a good and a trusted backup, i.e. copies, checkpoints, versions, before you start your actual migration. In other words, do you have a good copy that if something happens, you can refresh, whether it's a classic backup, whether it's a snapshot, a checkpoint, a consistency point, and have that at different layers, at different elevations, that you can go back, if you get into a bind, that you have that ability to go back in time to restart the migration or to refresh that process so that you can go back to whatever it was before you got started. Okay, so another thing here, and these first ones we're kind of going through quick, but as we go, we're going to start going in deeper. And with that, do understand how you will migrate. Are you going to migrate all at once? Are you going to migrate in phases or steps? This ties back to what we started with, is do have a plan. Don't migrate without knowing your full environment without a plan. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Understand how you're going to migrate. Well, again, here we see, without going in real deep, but that context comes back to play. How are you going to move? How are you going to migrate? How are you going to convert? Are you simply doing that lift and shift? How are you going to get there? Can you just do everything over the network? Do you have to physically copy things to an appliance or to storage devices that then physically get shipped to the destination and then imported and then resynchronized up? But how are you going to do it? How are you going to do that move, that migration, with no downtime? In other words, you're going to do it in real time, on the fly, with active environments, or are you going to coordinate with some downtime? How are you going to do it? And are you going to do everything at once, or a part of in stages or phases? In other words, some workloads, some apps, some data in different stages. So a phased approach over time. Are you going to be running the old environment with the new environment at the same time, that one of them is active? Or maybe some workload is active in the old environment, some active or app workload is active in the new environment, but that you can fail back if need be. Or are you simply going to take the approach, we're going to move everything, we're shutting everything down, and we're done with that old world? So in other words, you're not going to be able to fall back or go back in a point in time. Or are you going to leave the old environment running on-prem or at the cloud that you're moving from? Are you going to leave it there for a while and be able to fall back to it or leverage it as part of a near-term or perhaps long-term, where it gets provisioned into a backup, a disaster recovery, a business replication, a business continuity recovery site? That all ties back to what you're doing and why you're doing it. How will the data apps, along with the settings, your certificates, your keys, all the configurations, how are they going to be moved? Via network transfer, that physical shipment we touched on? Not sure. What are the options, or your pros and cons? So that's part of understanding, is how will you move? How much do you have to move in what given time? That ties back to knowing the environment, knowing what you have, knowing what the dependencies are. What can you move at different levels, and what's required to do that? So again, having that plan, having that understanding, knowing what you are, what are those different dependencies, along with how much needs to be moved. Okay, well, let's go a step further with this now. And with this in mind, here's a multi-step process. Okay, this is about have a plan, which is plan, prepare, do a proof of concept. What's the scope and context? Do a trial test, learning, educating, training. And what this also means is that awareness, the assessing, the analyzing, what to migrate, how to migrate. Are you going to do it all at once, or are you going to be doing it in phases? Remediation. You understand what you have. You understand how it's working. What needs to be updated? What layers in that stack need to be updated with new software or other updates, so that when you do that move, they're going to have better compatibility with where you're going. So applying any of the updates, making changes, and if need be, making updates to your tools, your scripts, and then moving into that execution stage, actually doing the move, the migrate, having those good backups that you can fall back to, having tested the process, doing that validity check, so that as the migration is occurring, You know that different steps are working, that you've hit different milestones, that you have different detection to verify that, yes, this step was done, but this step is also good. Everything is there, the validity check, the health check, everything seems to go, which then ends up to congratulations, the migration is done, but it's that next step, which is resolving any issues. Start the optimization phase, applying additional fixes, doing tuning, tuning from a performance, from an availability, reliability, a service standpoint, but also from a cost standpoint and monitoring. And then if you're all doing everything in one flow, well, you might be at your endpoint. But often that just simply takes you back somewhere else in this process step, where now it's time to start again with the next phase. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go a little deeper onto each of these here in this step. So in other words, do a proof of concept. Establish a test sandbox for learning and your test environment. So what do I mean? So as a part of that, it's getting started. That plan, prepare, proof of concept. Don't be scared, be prepared. Understand the scope, the context. Do a trial test, a learning. But also, what is that vision, that strategy, that plan? Who all is involved, or is it all up to you? What's the scope of moving or converting, rebuilding? What's your timeline, when things need to be done by, or what a particular phase or step needs to be done? Start that preparation. Again, that proof of concept, that test, that trial. Set up a lab in the cloud. Use that for learning, figuring out which of your tools, which of your scripts, what needs to be reconfigured or updated, or what new needs to be involved, so that you can start to set up what will be your target destination environment. What training? How will things be done on a larger scale? How are you going to leverage automation? What inventory do you have as it is, but what tools, service, and scripts are you going to be needing to do the actual work down the road here? Oh, and by the way, can any of your software licenses move with you to the cloud, or do you have to change your licensing? Do you have to relicense everything? Those are all part of the step. Moving along, going into the awareness. Again, understanding what do you have. It's more than just grabbing the virtual machine. You also have to have the data, the networking settings, but also keys, certificates, credentials, other settings. How are you going to handle authentication and authorization? Analyze the inventory result. In other words, figure out your bill of materials that during that proof of concept that you figured out what size machines, what size network, what storage configurations are you going to need. That factors also into the service and the costing standpoint, so that now you can start to set up that environment, leveraging templates that help you to configure for your given environment or to customize them. But again, it's working and leveraging what you can learn and what you know about your current environment, what you've learned through the proof of concept, what you've learned through your training, your education, applying different tools. But there's also in this step, which is getting ready for some remediation, cleaning up old data, old apps, figuring out what really doesn't need to be brought forward, archiving it or removing it, as well as what your timeline will be. And then that takes us to, don't forget about management, patches, data protection, i.e. backups. How are you going to back up? How are you going to protect things as you go forward, as you move into that new environment? What about your security, from authentication, authorization, to protecting your endpoints, whether they be public IPs or private IPs, but also having that insight and that reporting capability for the environment as you go into it. So with that in mind, part of that then is leveraging what you've learned, leveraging what you've gathered. Part of that gathering, oh, by the way, is metrics that matter. What kind of utilization are you currently seeing for memory, for compute, for storage, both from a capacity but performance. What sort of response time? What is the workload look like? And what are the metrics that also show you that, yeah, you might be running a server at a particular utilization, but how much work is being done? It's one thing to say, hey, we took our environment from running at 90% utilization going to the cloud, and we've got it down to 40%. Okay, but how are the apps running? How is the workload? How are the users? Are they seeing the same or better response time or worse? So part of that is having those metrics that matter, that tie back to the apps, that tie back to the workload. And that's not just your performance, but what about the health, the errors that are being detected? How do those look into it? So part of the remediation is having that backup, as we talked about, but identifying what needs to be ready for the cloud. And the different providers have tools or have guides that will help you out, which is, here's what you need to have done as part of your readiness to do before you move. This is kind of going on a trip. It's very much like going on a trip where you've got a checklist of, here's what you need to be ready before going on your vacation. You got your tickets, you got your reservations, you got your bags checked, and oh, by the way, here's what the baggage fees are going to be. Here's what you want to pack and carry with you versus putting into your checked luggage. It's similar to that, which again, understanding what you're going to need and having that plan, having that process, but also updating any things before you go that you know everything is working. Doing those pre-migration cleanup, collecting the credentials, having information available so that while you're in the process of the move, you can make adjustments, you can fix things, that you still have access to that information during the process. Again, it comes back to determining that timeline schedule for the migration. And there it is again, how will you actually move the data? And is your existing network and security set up for the cloud access? So part of that migration means that if you still have the users that are on-prem, but now they're going to be accessing workloads that are in the cloud, is your network set up for authenticating and giving access to those cloud resources, to those cloud endpoints, to the cloud load balancers, and vice versa, both for access but authorization for those that have different credentials for doing different things. So there's that part to it. But what about your software licenses? Are you simply going to move everything to the cloud, and then all of a sudden you realize that a particular app doesn't start up because it needs a different software license? How are you going to handle the training, the education for the different workers at different layers in that vertical stack? And then there's the upgrading your tools, your scripts, your management interfaces, your dashboards, updating your security, your data protection, all those things. That's just all part of this. Now, if it's a simple cloud migration, you're just simply going to move a small amount of workload from point A to B. Do you really need to go through all these? You could streamline this. Likewise, you're doing a major migration. Is it this simple as going through these? It might be more complex. You may have more subcategories, different aspects to it. This is just a general straw man, if you would, a general template that you can shrink down as need be, or you can expand and go into other areas as needed. And again, there's different tools that from different vendors that help for all these different processes, all these different steps. All right. So with that in mind, it's time for the move. Let's do it. You've got the destination environment ready. You're going to start validating things. Everything is good to go. You've got your backups. You're able to start the migration, however you're actually doing it. And then there are questions. Can you fail back if need be? Or is it an all or nothing move? And how are you going to be able to validate everything is working? And what are the different dependencies? So everything is ready to go. You're going to automate this, but you're going to manually monitor. You're going to get alerts. You're going to get progress that you can intervene if need be, or that you can restart a step as far as you go. In other words, if it's all automated, does that automation mean that from start to finish, if you're 75% of the way through, you have to start over, or are there checkpoints at various points that you can simply restart from that particular point in time? Are your management tools, is everything all set up, ready to go, and everybody trained for the new environment? Well, off you go. Okay, so don't be scared, be prepared, have your data protection ready. Just because you move to the cloud doesn't mean that you're instantly, automatically protected by things like ransomware, accidental deletion, things like that. The cloud helps, but also how you use that cloud, how you configure it, how your apps are leveraging things comes into play. So again, it's being aware of what are that particular cloud that destination is going to, what are their best practices, what are their recommendations, what are their capabilities, and how are you going to protect at different layers, okay? So with that in mind, here's just looking at big picture, that looking at things like making sure that you've got your certificates, your keys, that those are in place, that any new ones are generated and that they're ready for use. Being aware of any regulatory compliance issues from a geo standpoint for different geographies, whether it's different countries or even different states. How are those going to be handled? How are you handling your authentications, whether it's with an Active Directory or another mechanism? How are you handling passwords and credentials across different apps, different workloads, and have those different keys then made available? And do you have things like SSH access or other capabilities? Are they enabled and authenticated? You have your firewalls, your load balancers, any VPNs if you're using those, taken care of. But also your endpoints for your workloads, your endpoints for services, endpoints for storage. Are they all taken care of? Are they all handled? So there's these different things that come into play that, depending on the environment, depending on that complexity, depending on what you're doing, how will that all be accomplished? So again, we're giving you a bunch of different things here to think about, to look into, that all factor into how are you going to actually address your cloud migration. Okay, so we've done some do's, we've done some don'ts, some additional do's. We did a couple don'ts here, and here's another one. Don't forget about post-migration optimization. Yeah, you did the migration. Everything is good. High fives around the room. It's party time. Get the balloon. Have some fun. You should. But you also need to understand, how are things running or not? How is the data? Is it there, but is it accessible, or is it still encrypted? Did something happen that the data's there, it's all intact, but the keys aren't working, or the endpoints aren't authenticated? Are the users happy? If you're sitting back enjoying, everybody's having a great time, relaxing, and you're like, hey, you know what? It's really quiet. Yeah, everything went smooth. This was a fantastic migration. And then all of a sudden somebody says, hey, wait a minute. It's too quiet. Maybe make a couple of phone calls. How are things? People are like, well, we're still waiting to get in, and we're not quite sure yet. Well, that might be a sign that something isn't quite right yet. So, yeah, celebrate, enjoy, but also check. Make sure that things are okay. And what you might find is you check with some users, and they say, well, yeah, fine. Everything is fine. Why are you calling? Well, we just wanted to make sure everything was good. We did upgrades over the weekend. Oh, yeah, everything is fine. Boy, that's what you want to hear. So are there any issues with performance, with security, with the network, with alerts, detections? Are all of a sudden you being flooded with network security alerts because all of a sudden it's like, oh, you know what? We forgot to configure that these particular ports or these particular endpoints or these particular apps that, oops, here, that's a quick, easy fix. Or is there something else going on? But also part of this is going back in and looking at how are things running. Are you over-provisioned? Are you under-provisioned? Or is everything just right? It's that opportunity to look to see is our resources underutilized. Maybe that's an opportunity to optimize costs by right-sizing to a different size server or compute or network or other service. Or are you starving in that quest to save money? Are you starving applications out because you saved money going to the cloud, but now you've got performance issues? Well, maybe it's time to upgrade those particular things. And what are your management tools indicating? What is the health and the status? What is the plan to address any problems, to fix them? What additional changes or conversions or migrations that need to be done? And if need be, can you fall back, whether it's on an app basis or everything? And then again, what is your cloud spending? What are your costs looking like? That opportunity to go in there and optimize not only your security, not only your network or your access, your performance, response time, but also update the cost. And the updating the cost, again, I'm going to re-echo this. It's not always about cutting costs, cutting service. It's also about not starving workload, not starving applications out. In other words, being a penny wise, pound foolish by trying to save too much at the expense of causing a productivity problem. That's part of that understanding the apps their workload needs. But also, what are the lessons learned? How to leverage those on a go-forward basis, apply the fixing, the tuning, and away you go. Okay, so with that, don't be scared of cloud migration. You want to be prepared. So what does that mean? Real simple. It's having that plan, knowing your workload, understanding the context. Don't migrate without knowing your environment and the dependencies. Don't migrate without knowing your resource requirements and the metrics that matter. Have that trusted, that verified backup and copies that you could go back to if need be, but also have those running in the new environment. Yeah, clouds provide protection, but what granularity of protection do you need or want at different layers? Do that proof of concept. Do understand how you're going to migrate, but don't forget about the management tools, the remediation, the cleaning, the updates, and the optimization. All right. So in terms of next steps, what does that put us? Wrapping up for now, before we go into some Q&A, understand what type of cloud migration. Context matters. How will you migrate? Are you going to use the different automation tools that are available? Are you going to do it manual? Are you going to do it all at once? Know your environment, know the biz, the apps, the requirements, the workload profiles, having metrics at management, having the inventory of the apps, the data, and the resources and their dependencies. Practice, learn, test, apply remediation, optimize. You can learn more on my site, storageioblog.com, in my books, my Twitter, there's my contact. Speaking of books, software-defined data infrastructure essentials, information about all these topics and a lot more. So with that, let's bring David back in. And David, I think we got time for some Q&A.
Yes, we do. We have some questions in the console right now. And before we get to those, I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And now let's go to those questions. Let's just take them on a first come, first serve basis, Greg. So if you want to follow along, I'll be starting from the bottom question and moving my way up. That's because that's the order they came in. And it just so happens the first two questions have to do with the developers. First one reads, our developers insist we migrate all of our apps to cloud native before moving to the cloud. What should we do?
Great question, David. And real simple, move your developers to the cloud, get their environment in the cloud where they can do their development, their testing, resolve or refine their DevOps philosophy if that's what they're doing, where they can do their proof of concepts, and where they can start working on things so that they can get a checkbox that, hey, they've got that environment, they're working on that. But it's also a checkbox to show management that, yeah, we are in the cloud, we're seeing these benefits, these are things that we're going to be doing, and then work from there.
Okay, here's a very related question. Maybe you can add on to your answer. What's a good step process to migrate to cloud? Should we move developers there first?
Yeah, this really comes back to there's a technology approach to it and there's the business, which is from a business, why are you going to the cloud? What is it that you're looking to accomplish? Is it cost savings, cost benefit, cost reduction, cost avoidance? What is it you're trying to do? Is something constrained? So it might be that you have to do some lift and ship, quick moves to get some things into the cloud. Or maybe it's you're moving part of your data protection into the cloud. That might be the one approach, but it could also be is, hey, let's put the developers in the cloud, and whether they're going to deploy into the cloud or deploy back to on-prem, let's move them in there where they've got the resources, they've got the capabilities of facilitating the legacy, regardless of where that's deployed, but also to be starting to work on the new or the next thing as a part of that. So it's one of those where it depends, but there could be a lot more to it depending on the given environment.
Okay, here's a question from Kabetti in the audience. I hope I pronounced that right. What is the major criteria to choose which cloud service is better?
Do you have any preferences? Okay. So in other words, if you're a Microsoft environment, that might guide you, it might steer you, it might influence you to Azure. But it doesn't mean you couldn't go to AWS or go to Google or some others. The question, or what usually comes up, is cost. All right, which cloud is cheaper? Well, that is a consideration, but don't make that your only consideration. What is the compatibility? How does it fit in with either your preferences or the paradigm of your environment? What are the technical capabilities? What are the services, the capabilities? And if you're going to if cost is a major concern, then the prep needs to look at the cloud and the total cloud cost of ownership, which is looking at things on a whole basis versus just simply looking at who's got the cheapest storage at the cheapest performance level or the lowest cost CPU. Look at it in the context of your organization and what that workload is. But then there can also be other factors in that some people may go to AWS because they have a different business relationship with an Amazon. They might go Azure, not because they're using a lot of Windows existing, but because they're doing other things that the Azure is a different option for them. And you've got all the different ones of the major players or the smaller or the regional players.
Okay, next question. What if all we are doing is moving our data protection to the cloud?
Congratulations, good for you. You're on your road. That if that's the only thing you're going to do for the cloud, fantastic, good for you. Now you can start to look at other opportunities, whether it's adding protection in different ways, but that's a part of it. Key thing there, though, is make sure that whatever you protect to the cloud, that you're able to also protect and restore either into the cloud or back to on-prem.
Okay. Jorge from the audience has a question. We use AWS for disaster recovery. We are looking to create some VMs for India to use. Would it make sense to stay with AWS, or is mixing and matching okay?
All right, great question. If AWS is working out for you, or Azure for that matter, or any of the others, ask the question, is there a benefit, business or technology, to leverage somebody else. If you're able to do everything within AWS and work across the different regions and have those capabilities and the costing is good, the technology is good, that could be a good reason for just staying there. If your data, if you've got some workload already in AWS, yeah, it would make sense, especially if other apps need to access that data. That's where you want to put your machines. That's where you want to put your compute. But then you also want to look at it from a resiliency standpoint, spreading things out. Does it make sense to having some workload in another cloud? And then you have to balance the complexity across running a multi-cloud, that hybrid environment. Balance the cost and the complexity of the management of it.
Okay, great. I'd like to remind you, audience, we have plenty of time for more questions, so please send them on in because Greg lives and breathes this stuff, so this is a great opportunity for someone to get some expert one-on-one discourse. And for some more one-on-one discourse, the next question reads, what are cloud cost components? Is it just about monthly cloud costs?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different costs to consider, okay? The number one mistake is, for example, just looking at the computer, just looking at what the storage is. And like for data protection, it's like, oh, hey, let's just go use the cheapest, lowest cost object storage that's out there. We don't worry about performance because we just want to do it on low cost. So you have to look at what are you paying for? What are you getting? And things will vary. Something else that will vary is that you've got your components, compute, network, storage, but each of those then have different variations. These, atop of those, you can also have different services, API calls, management interfaces, specialized functionality for containers, for serverless, for AI cognitive sorts of things, for databases, different things, different workloads. But there are the different components of compute for memory, for CPUs, for GPUs, number of core, things like that. Networking bandwidth, but also IPs and endpoints. There's a storage, just like with regular storage, you've got capacity, but you also have different performance characteristics, different durability. So all those things add up for your cloud cost. But then there's a big variable, which is, are you buying just in time? It's kind of like traveling. You walk up to the airport and say, I want to go somewhere today. You might be paying a higher price, regardless of if you're flying first class, business class, coach, or comfort, whatever. You're also going to be paying because you're walk up versus pre-buying. So are there discounts available? Absolutely. There are discounts is if you prepay, if you pre-buy these resources. Yeah, you're getting locked in for a year, 2 years, 3 years, different things like that. But those are capabilities to help your cloud cost and then be able to adjust accordingly. But there's also costs to be aware of things like API calls. How many free API calls do you get per month? How many service requests do you get per month? Are you being charged for pulling data out or moving it across different locations? Are you being charged for reserved IPs versus dynamic IPs? So all those things factor in. Those all tie back to knowing your apps, knowing your workload, knowing what the resources are, your dependencies, so you can put that together.
Okay, everything you ever wanted to know about cost. Let's move from cost to content. Sari from the audience says, suppose when we are using multi-cloud, what specific content to what cloud? So what do you think, Greg? Does it matter?
Where do you put on what cloud? That's really going to come down to if different clouds have the same capability to host those same workloads, the same apps, the same data, based on what you're using or what tools you're using. If those are all equal, it could come down to cost. It could also come down to just simple preferences as well as which of those clouds have better support in a particular geography, a particular location, as well as meeting special requirements such as geo-regulatory or secure clouds, confidential computing, gov clouds, things like that.
Okay, here's a question from Lynn in the audience. You could probably spend a whole session on this question, but maybe you can summarize an answer. Lynn asks, how does cloud migration affect an organization's existing IT infrastructure and operations? And what changes might be required?
Yeah, we could spend hours on this. I spent part of a book on this. But hey, real simple. Assuming you're not giving up your current IT environment, rather you're going to a hybrid cloud environment, what that means is that bringing cloud management concepts, cloud-like concepts into your existing IT environment. It's bringing your existing IT environment into the cloud world, into that cloud realm, updating management, updating services, making it so easy for users to provision resources, that resources get provisioned a lot faster, that they get reporting on and metrics on how their resources, how their apps are behaving. So it's more of a coexistence unless you're just simply, you've gone to the new world, you're going to do like some have done in the history and burn the ship so you can't go back, so be it. But it can also be where you're going to maintain and you're going to have that hybrid environment.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in two more quick questions here.
Sure.
Let's get back to the basics here, Greg. What's the difference between containers, serverless, and cloud native?
Yeah. Okay, containers are just another unit of allocation. Think of it as buying by the shot versus buying by the bottle versus buying by the box or keg. It's a different unit of consumption versus, say, running in a virtual machine, which you could have running on a physical machine. It's just a unit of granularity. Serverless is where you've got your app that might run on a container, but instead of it running on a container, either in your prem or on a virtual machine or in the cloud, that app, that code is going to run within the cloud in a serverless environment. In other words, you're just going to simply drop that code. It's going to run when told to do so. Cloud native is taking your apps, creating a new app, and leveraging things like containers, leveraging things like serverless, leveraging the underlying resource layers as you craft and define this new environment that's in a more modularized, componentized sort of environment.
Okay, last question. Staying on the container and cloud native track, do we need to convert everything to containers and cloud native?
No. Now, some are going to argue, yes, everything has to go. Well, okay, good for them. Good for you if that's what you want to do, if that's what you need to do. But the reality is some things are better in cloud native. Some things are better where they're currently at. It might be moving them around. It might be optimizing them, and maybe over time they get shifted. That goes back to that, are you doing things in phases? Are you doing things in different ways or in different steps? What's applicable for your environment?
Okay, well, looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Greg, for a great presentation and answering all those audience questions.
No worries, my pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsor, VMware, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Cloud Migration 101 Summit called The Biggest Hurdles of Cloud Migration and How to Avoid Them. Our speaker for this session is Elias Kneser, Chief of Research at the EK Media Group. Elias is a thought leader in the area of cloud computing and digital disruption. Until recently, Elias was a research vice president at Gartner, where he spent 7 years focusing on private, hybrid, and public cloud computing. Today, Elias continues to conduct research and advice and engage customers and vendors on all aspects of cloud, edge, and data center transformation strategies. He is well known for his ability to simplify complex technical concepts and explain how IT aligns with and forwards business goals. Take it away, Elias.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the opportunity, and thank you, everyone, for joining in. Thank you, Chris, for editing all of my articles on Redmond and everything that you do. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you as well. Folks, thank you for making time today. Like Chris said, I'm Chief of Research at EK Media Groups, and prior to that, I was at Gartner for 7 years, focusing on these types of topics. Today, I'm independent, and if you like this type of content, please make sure we connect on YouTube or LinkedIn or whichever social media outlet you use. I post this type of content frequently. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I've talked to thousands of customers about, which are the hurdles that you go through when you're going through a cloud migration. And if I'm being honest with everyone today, there is really and realistically one hurdle that kind of consumes them all. And that hurdle is not having a cloud strategy. Everything else that we're going to talk about today is going to be a consequence, is going to be a reaction. It is going to be the reason for not having a cloud strategy is why you're going to be having these challenges. A cloud strategy is going to make it easy when you're spending money, when it's time to have a cost conversation. If there's a business driver, if there's executive sponsorship, if you've aligned your cloud strategy and the reason you're migrating with the business, then you've converted IT from really a cost center to a revenue center. And I don't want to say at this point, cost won't matter, but the focus, the obsession that us in IT have with cost is significantly reduced when there is alignment with the business. Your goal as an IT leader, as a technical professional, is to make technology and business indistinguishable. Today, in the digital era, IT is the business. You shouldn't be able to differentiate between them. But everything we're going to talk about today is going to be a result, a consequence of not having a cloud strategy. Now, when we talk about a cloud strategy, it's important to understand, well, Eli, what do you mean exactly by a cloud strategy? Is it simply having a document? I'm going to say having a cloud strategy is a trinity. It's 3 pillars. You definitely need to have your cloud strategy document. That's the CSD. That is your business-centric document. That is what is going to align IT and business on a shared vision of cloud. This is a document that whoever is leading the charge for cloud is going to do in collaboration with an executive sponsor, maybe the CIO, maybe several subject matter experts within the organization. But that is going to be a short document that aligns everything together, that talks about, hey, this is why we're even migrating to cloud. These are all of the reasons, the drivers. This is what it means for the business. This should not and never should be an IT-focused or even written document. Now, the second document is a cloud adoption framework. This is where you're going to outline the different steps that you're going to take along your migration. And the reason the cloud adoption framework is crucial is because it builds on the cloud strategy document that you've put together. It outlines the different steps that you need to complete in order to successfully migrate to the cloud. This allows you to visualize your whole process. It essentially becomes like a pipeline where in stage 1, I'm going to be building my cloud strategy document. I'm going to do an application assessment of my portfolio. I'm going to do this with skills, etc. By being able to identify all of these things, by visualizing them, you reduce one of the biggest hurdles of migration, which are unknown and surprises. Now, when you're doing any kind of migration, there's always going to be surprises and unknowns. But our goal is to significantly reduce that, and we do that by adopting a framework that's either been proven, that's been successful, by having either consultants or in-house experts that have been there, done that in other places potentially, put something like that together so that we know who we are delegating certain tasks to. For example, part of the subject matter experts that will be involved in your cloud adoption framework are going to be your networking team, but it's also going to be the security team. It's going to be whoever's responsible for governance. You're going to have to figure out the prerequisites, who needs to do what first. All of these things get flushed out in your cloud adoption framework. Once you have a solid cloud adoption framework that's been circulated, that's been socialized, that everyone agrees on, now we move into cloud implementation plans, or SIPs. What you're doing with SIPs is you're taking every step of your cloud adoption framework and you're delegating it to a subject matter expert. So the cloud adoption framework is no one person or one team's sole responsibility. The idea behind it, the nice thing about it, is it acts almost like a project. You're able to delegate these tasks to subject matter experts so that the security team needs to know, this is what I'm responsible for, this is when I need to start working on this, this is when I need to implement it. They all would start to develop these cloud implementation plans. Now, why do I talk about all of these three things? Winston Churchill once said, if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail. The more that we plan, the less we reduce the hurdles of failing. The more we have these cloud implementation plans, the more transparency we're going to have during the migration, the more we reduce the risk of the unknowns because we're doing our homework. Every team is doing their homework in a specific task of the cloud adoption framework. And when everything comes together, all of a sudden you have your executive sponsor, your business drivers in the cloud strategy document. You've got your roadmap in the cloud adoption framework. And then finally, you have the actual implementation plans in your SIPs. All three of those reduce the hurdle of cloud migration significantly. Now, if we move on to number two, the other hurdle that I've seen a lot of organizations fall into is ownership of the cloud migration process. These types of projects should never be done by community. Hey, this whole team is going to be responsible for this. There has to be a single person that owns the process, that is responsible for the migration, that you can hold accountable, that you can have measurable progress that you can request from this person. So assigning the responsibility to a specific team without one person that it will specifically be responsible for that will be a challenge and a hurdle. So this person can be a project administrator. In my world, I typically call this person the cloud architect. Other customers will call this person the cloud business manager. Whatever the nomenclature that you want to put around this person, this is the entity that you are going to hold responsible for the progress of your cloud migration. They are responsible during the cloud strategy documents for finding a business sponsor. And that sounds a lot easier than it is, because what you'll have to do is you'll have to go interview a lot of your executive sponsors. Try to figure out who's willing to even talk, who even knows about cloud, or who you can even educate. So they need to be able to give you the time so you can explain the importance of cloud, how cloud will become a business differentiator, not just a technical thing that we have within IT. So identifying that business sponsor, getting them involved in this whole process will become crucial. They'll be the person responsible for ideating, for documenting, for communicating the cloud strategy. So first you have to have conversations, then you have to document, then you have to socialize it. So that would be important. For translating the business outcomes into technical requirements, again, that becomes really crucial. And then this person leads the cloud program and is the foundation of what later will become your cloud center of excellence. So make sure you have someone during this migration process that you can hold responsible, that you can hold accountable for this process. Number three is going to be your cloud skills shortage. See, this is crucial for any migration project because it's so important in the cloud era for technical folks to understand that every technical decision they make has an immediate cost implication. Now, for those of you that have been around for a while, we'll take a step back and say, hey, Eli, I kind of think this was always the case. And you wouldn't be wrong. You're kind of right. The only difference is if historically, if 20 years ago, you were to configure a SAN that cost, $3 million. And when you received that SAN, maybe you over-configured it by $500,000. It wasn't the end of the world. We always needed more storage. You were always able to figure out how to reallocate that storage. It was a capital expenditure. It was a big deal, but it wasn't a big deal, so to speak. Today, every technical decision you make will show up on your cloud bill at the end of the month. So it's in your face a lot quicker. It's more apparent. It's more obvious. And you're probably wondering, well, what kind of mistake could I make? So without the right cloud skills, if we just take what we've learned in the data center and try to apply that in the cloud, that will significantly increase your cloud cost, your cloud spend. I'm going to give you some basic examples, but this is just to illustrate what I'm trying to say. If on premises you have a web server farm that consists of, 20 web servers. If you decide to go to the cloud and as part of your cloud migration, you're going to simply move 20 web servers from point A on premises to point B in the cloud, then you really haven't made any kind of modifications to this workload. It's going to cost you probably exactly the same thing that it's costing you on premises, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but you really haven't done much there. However, someone that understands the cloud, understands the capabilities of cloud, has the right mindset, will take these 20 web servers and say, I'm going to create an auto-scaling group. I'm going to deploy 3 web servers. I'm going to create the right policies to add or remove servers depending on performance. And then bada bing, bada boom, instead of having 20 web servers, now you have 3. You've optimized the workload. You've reduced what you're potentially paying at the end of the month. This is a very basic example without having to go into a lot of the details. But cloud skills, and again, this applies to workloads. You can take this across the board, to governance, to the number of accounts you have, to the networking complexities, and so on and so forth. So addressing the cloud skills shortage becomes crucial for a successful migration, because the last thing you want, if you don't have the right skills, if you're not using the right partners, is to get midway through your cloud migration project and the project is going to stall. Now, some of the skills that we're looking for in terms of cloud skills are your usual suspects. You've seen those already, right? Your cloud networking. It's similar to data center networking, but not entirely. Cloud security, similar to on-premises security, but not entirely. And to make things worse, or to increase the complexity when you're going to cloud, these days you're not just going to one cloud provider. Most organizations that I talk to, I actually don't remember talking to an organization today that doesn't have multi-cloud. So you're not dealing with just one, you're dealing with multiple, 2 or 3 public cloud providers in addition to what you have on premises. And you have to apply all of these skills that are on the screen and uniformly be able to manage all of these for all environments. So that's what makes it a lot more complex, a lot more difficult to manage. This is where automation, for example, will play a large role. Your ability to bring tools and capabilities like Terraform or Ansible or Puppet or Chef to help you with this process. Doing cost optimization, there's a ton to be done there. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. But how are you going to do cost optimization? One aspect is to make sure you're architecting for cloud. That's crucial. But your ongoing cost optimization is also crucial. You're going to need tools that help you continuously monitor your environment and make adjustments as needed. Governance will be crucial. Your ability to make sure that not anyone that wants to create cloud assets, whether it's a virtual machine or a container or anything else, is able to without, for example, putting a tag. Hey, this asset that we just created belongs to the accounting department or belongs to the marketing department. You need to have that oversight, that governance, so that at the end of the month, you're able to at least have an inventory of who is responsible for all of this cloud cost. So these become crucial in addition to also understanding, source code management and all of these skills that you're seeing here. So cloud skills become crucial for your migration process. Understanding APIs is also crucial. This is for your developers, but also for your INO folks. And we're going to talk about INO folks because I come out of INO, and there was a question in the earlier session that I actually would love to re-answer. But understanding APIs is crucial because everything today is APIs. Everything should be APIs, whether it's your on-premises environment, whether you're connecting to managed services, whether it's the edge, IoT, the network, SaaS. Everything you should be able to integrate through APIs in order to enable the automation levels that we were talking about earlier. Automation has to go hand in hand with APIs if you're going to have a streamlined, consistent environment across multi-cloud, your on-premises environment, and potentially the edge as well. So how do we handle the skills gap? Because yes, it's a challenge, but you're probably saying, well, what do I do? One of the things that I advise customers and organizations to do is to establish what's known as a talent enablement program. So bringing more structure to how you're going to deal with the skills gap. Because the skills gap is not just about, well, I'm going to go hire someone. It's not going to be about, well, I'm going to send someone out to learn something and get a certification. Getting a certification isn't going to, it's not going to be enough to plug the experience gap. And where are all the challenges going to happen during your migration? They're going to happen with the lack of experience, not necessarily because you don't have the right AWS or Azure or Google certification. It's how do you deal with the problem as you're doing the migration? We want someone that's potentially seen something like this that can react to it quicker. So how do we do this? We're going to do this using a couple of different approaches. Continuous learning is something that is cultural, that everyone is probably doing. Those of you that aren't doing should be doing. You want to encourage continuous learning no matter your age. I actually just came across someone that was an older gentleman not too long ago in their 70s that's still going to college. I was so proud of that person because at that age, they were still trying to learn. They were still trying to do things. In my career, I've been doing this for the last 30 years. I still learn. I still enjoy certification. I still like to take training classes. So the idea of continuous learning is something that you should encourage. Now, above and beyond that, as an organization, you should also have a tech skills transparency document. Now, what is a tech skills transparency document and why do you need it? Historically, during my career, for example, I'll tell you a story. This was back in, 2001. My manager came up to me once and says, Eli, I have budget. What kind of training would you like to take? And back then, I'm like, well, you know what? This VMware thing sounds cool. And since VMware is the sponsor today, it's kind of fitting. I'm like, this VMware thing sounds cool. I'm going to go take VMware. And I kid you not, I went to a 5-day VMware course. I got through the first 2 days, 2.5 days. I got up and left. I was so excited. I came back to my company and I'm like, we are going to virtualize everything. And they all laughed at me, like, whatever, in your dreams, what's virtualization? We got to a point where they wouldn't allow me to add VMs to Active Directory. That's how strict they were. And then we ended up virtualizing everything a couple of years later. But I tell you this story to highlight that in most organizations, they'll usually have a budget for training, for certification, and they'll come up to the employee and say, well, what do you want to take? Today, you need to flip the script. That doesn't work anymore. Today, you have to advertise to your employees, hey, those of you that are interested in working for this organization for the next 5 years, these are the skills that we as an organization need. Now, on that list, you can have things like cloud governance, like automation, like infrastructure as code, which is also part of automation, et cetera, et cetera. You are essentially highlighting to them what they need to take if they want to be relevant for this organization. And the reason you are able to come up with this list, Bueller, anyone? Well, if you have a cloud strategy that you've put in place, then as a consequence of that, you're going to know the skills that you need, and you're able to advertise them in order to plug the gap that you're going to have. So advertise a skills transparency list so that they know what to take, what to invest in, instead of, hey, we're going to the cloud, but someone is taking an AS400 course. I'm kidding, of course, but you get what I mean. Now, the other thing that you can do is do a skills gap analysis. Now, the skills gap analysis, you can do that on an individual level so that you understand what your capabilities are, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are. But the organization can also do that across all of the technical employees so that they know where the gap lies, where they need to hire, where they need to spend money to train, where the experience lack, maybe you bring in a partner. Those become crucial in how you're going to continue to maintain these skills. And the last thing I'll say that I found very, very impactful and effective, and one of the programs that's near and dear to my heart, is some kind of an apprenticeship program. Now, when you talk about this type of a program, you have to realize that some folks are going to be, they're going to be an apprentice in one area, but they're going to be an expert in another area. And that's okay. This is the thing that you want to communicate is, hey, if you're not an expert in cloud, but maybe you're an expert in, again, containers or serverless, part of cloud, but I'm trying to highlight, it's okay for you to be a senior in one area and potentially a junior in another area. We are all trying to help one another We are continuously trying to learn and bring the organization forward. So creating an apprenticeship program will really be impactful, especially if you know that you have some individuals in your organization that already have the skills and the experience, and you're trying to make sure you're bringing the rest of the team together. Then this type of a program is extremely rewarding for all parties. Those that are teaching will get a very nice reward out of it, and those that are learning will get a good reward out of it as well. Now, number 4 is an application portfolio assessment. Now, I know you've heard this a million times, but when you're going to the cloud, having done the homework of how you're going to move an application to the cloud is going to be crucial. And I know you've seen these 5 R's many times before. There's various variations of them. But I want to highlight them because this is part of your due diligence. This is part of what you need to do. This is part of how you're going to reduce the hurdles and the challenges that you're going to face during the application migration process. Now, when you're looking at your application portfolio, you have to start making determinations on an application by application basis. Not all applications should be lifted and shifted to the cloud. That's your rehost. Some applications you might want to refactor. Now, Eli, what do you mean by refactor? I'm going to give you specific examples. I gave you the example of the web servers earlier. That's an example of refactoring the application. Another example of refactoring the application, if your application on premises happens to have a database server as a component, that database server is probably either a physical machine or a virtual machine. Moving it to an Azure SQL server or Azure as a SQL as a service, that would be part of refactoring. Maybe moving it to AWS RDS, that would be part of refactoring. If you've got a load balancer on premises and you're moving it to the cloud, using the native load balancers, you're refactoring the application because you're adding PaaS components to this application. It's still mostly an application that's at the infrastructure level, but you're accessorizing it with these native components. So you're refactoring it, and that refactoring is going to yield some cost benefits, some support benefits as well. Are you going to revise the application? Meaning, I'm going to take this entire application and rework it, but I'm not going to rewrite it. But I'm just going to rework all the different components, maybe refactor the whole application, so to speak. Maybe you're going to rewrite the application. You're going to get rid of it, and you're going to rewrite it completely using cloud platform, using the cloud native, whatever the case is. Or you're going to replace it potentially with SaaS. Now, the mistake that some customers make as they're going through and assessing their cloud portfolio is if they find a SaaS alternative to an application, they immediately go to SaaS. And I'm here to say you should do more due diligence when you find a SaaS alternative to your application. And no, just because there's a SaaS alternative does not automatically mean that you should be going with SaaS. Sometimes the cost of that SaaS application is prohibitive. I'll give you some quick examples of what I mean by that. When you're going to SaaS, it's a different interface. The features, the functionality that you're used to for the same application on premises might not exist in that SaaS application. Sometimes the cost of training your end users, not your IT folks, but the end users that are going to use the application, the cost is so prohibitive and disruptive to the business that you end up not doing the SaaS migration. You end up just moving the application so that you reduce the amount of training time and downtime you have. Sometimes the lock-in that you get out of moving it into a SaaS is not business. There's no justification for it. So there's a lot of factors to consider as you're moving. The only advice I'll give you is just because there's a SaaS alternative doesn't automatically mean you should be going with a SaaS for your application. So make sure you're doing all of the due diligence on these applications, figuring out on an application by application basis which application is going to move and how you're going to move it to the cloud. Number 5 is going to be application performance after migration. Now, again, all of these are going to be a consequence of the skills that we talked about, and they're going to be a consequence of the cloud strategy we talked about. Now, the one thing that I tell my customers as you're looking to go to the cloud is you have to understand the capabilities and the limitations of the cloud environment that you're migrating to. You have to understand what you can do with this. What types of virtual machines or instances you're going to have. What kind of containers are you going to use? What kinds of CPUs are you going to use? Are you going to use spot instances? How are you going to do your IOPS? Are you going to use, for example, things like AWS provisioned IOPS in order to get the performance that you need? So understanding the capabilities of that environment and its limitations is crucial. Remember, you are now deploying on an environment that's not your infrastructure. You didn't build it, but you have to use it. So you have to be very familiar with what it's capable of. At what point does it break? What are the maximums of this environment? For example, small things. How many instances can you put in a VPC? I'm curious if anyone in the audience knows. I'll say the same question for a VNet. What is the maximum virtual machine that you can put for a VNet? Can you raise that limit? Can you not? And so on and so forth. So understanding these capabilities becomes crucial. You're deploying on a cloud platform. You need to understand how far you can go with that. Understanding the application requirements. And I know most of you probably know this. If you've worked in the data center, we've always tried to understand the application requirements. But in the data center, we had control over the everything. Here we don't. So the application requirements now have to be transposed onto the cloud platform, especially if you decided in the earlier step that you're not just shifting and lifting. Because with shift and lift, to some degree, you can control the performance because all of the components are very similar to what you had on premises. But when you start to do refactoring and add PaaS components to your application, like, for example, the example I gave with, the Azure SQL. Now you have to know what are the capabilities of that Azure SQL or the RDS database that's running SQL. What are the capabilities that you can expect so that you know how to architect this application? What are the capabilities of the native load balancer? How much load can you put on it before you need another load balancer? All of these things you're not going to figure out unless you test, which is why getting over some of these requirements, meaning that those cloud implementation plans that we talked about before, they should have included a test phase for your application so that you know exactly how this application is going to run and the types of performance that you can expect to get from it. Now, another thing that I find with cloud migration that usually stalls it is cloud adoption resistance. Oftentimes, you're going to find that the teams don't necessarily want to move to the cloud, whether it's not a great understanding of the cloud, whether they perceive the cloud as being a threat to the current job that they have or their career progression. Maybe people don't want to leverage the cloud. They don't believe in the cloud. There's adoption resistance. Now, how do you get around adoption resistance? There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. But the most effective one, if you've done your job right and you've completed the cloud strategy, I'm going to keep taking you back to the cloud strategy, and there's executive sponsorship and there's business buy-in, then this is no longer a IT project. It should never be an IT project. I actually don't believe that there are IT projects. There are only business projects. But as you get business buy-in, as business and technology become indistinguishable and you're moving towards making cloud a competitive business advantage, then the adoption resistance kind of fades away because everyone starts to realize, hey, this is not John is leading this project and we're going to go to the cloud. The entire organization is moving in this direction. So if you want to stay within this organization, you have to be on board because this is a competitive advantage. This is how we're going to generate revenue. This is not just an IT new project anymore. This is why the executive sponsor is crucial. This is why buy-in, business buy-in is crucial. The other thing that I would say that would modify behavior, because no matter how much I talk about business buy-in, you're still going to have folks that are stubborn, whatever. So you're going to have to start modifying behaviors. And the way that you do that, now that conferences are back and hopefully they're back permanently and they continue to grow and you start attending more and more, again, use the same approach that I talked about for training. Don't just say, well, what kind of conference would you like to go to? I have budget. If they come back and select a conference that does not align with the skills or the goals or where the organization is going, decline it. Force them to go to another conference. For example, if your organization decided that they're going to go with AWS or with AWS and Microsoft or AWS, Microsoft, and Google, whatever combination of that, then what you do is you move that budget towards, if you're attending a conference, I want you to attend reInvent or Ignite or Google Cloud Next or whatever the case might be, right? The reason you're doing that is because now they're going to attend these conferences, they're going to participate in hackathons, they are going to network with like-minded individuals. Slowly but surely, you are starting to influence how they think, how they're perceiving cloud. they start to have a more relaxed approach towards cloud. It's not threatening anymore. So you have to use the tools at your disposal to influence their attitudes in this case. You also want to go beyond training and certification. What do I mean by that? Someone just brought in an AWS certification or an Oracle certification or a VMware certification. Certifications are great. They help you establish a foundation. But when you don't use the skill sets that you have, they start to fade away. So one of the things that I advise customers to do is to create what's known as assignments. So create these basic exercises. Think of them as labs, and they are available everywhere. You can either have your subject matter experts create them, you can have partners create them, you can buy them potentially. But what you do with these labs is you assign them to someone and say, I want you to go build me an application that's deployed across 2 regions that has a global load balancer in front of it. Use a free tier account. What you're doing there is you're making sure that their skills remain sharp. So you're continuously challenging them with these labs. Don't just rely on them. Use these labs to also potentially grade bonuses and so on and so forth. And then align the budget with the skills transparency list that we talked about. Again, make sure that any skills and training they're taking is part of what you would like them to take. And then finally, you want to reward those that are taking the initiative, those that are actually cooperating. You want to be able to reward them so that you're rewarding this type of behavior. Now, the one that everyone's been waiting for, which is cost management. Look, there's really no magic wand, so to speak, for cost management. However, I do want to say that as IT, as cloud practitioners, we tend to obsess over cost. And this obsession with cost has existed since before the cloud. I don't recall a time or an era in my entire career where I was able to go to my manager and say, I need something. Oh, yeah, I have plenty of budget. It's always been for the last 30 years, oh, we're cutting costs. Oh, I don't have budget. It's like, it's a broken record. I've only wanted 1 year where they're like, yeah, that's no problem. We have excess budget this year. It's never been the case. It's always been about our budget is tight. We're trying to control the budget every single year. So as IT, we tend to obsess over the budget, and we're obsessing over the budget because we're always being blamed for being a very expensive cost center. So folks, in today's world, we are able to flip the script. In a digital era, in the digital economy, in the digital transformation that we're going to, the business cannot transform without technology. As a result, the cost is not just your responsibility. This is the cost of doing business. And as a result, do not obsess about it. You have to be cost conscious. You have to do everything that you can, but do not try to solve the cost problem. But there are things that you can do. As part of migrating to the cloud, we talked about the idea of modifying the application architecture for the cloud. That doesn't always mean that, hey, we're never going to do lift and shift, because I've come across a lot of customers that say, I'm never going to do a lift and shift. That's not cloud. I'm going to tell you, there isn't a cloud environment that exists on the planet that doesn't have some form of lift and shift in it, some VMs that exist, some containers that exist. It's not all cloud native. It's not all cloud platforms. So don't try to stall the project because you couldn't modify every application. Wherever you can, refactor the application, accessorize it with PaaS services, with cloud native services. You want to do that. And wherever possible, wherever it makes sense financially, yes, you want to rewrite it. So keep those in mind. Some of the other hurdles when you're doing cloud migration that have a high cost is long migration process. The long migration process is a result of challenges that you're having during the migration. Why are you having challenges? Well, because you don't have a clear cloud strategy or because you don't have the right skills. What happens? The process of migration becomes very long, and as a result, you spend more money. How do we do this? How do we resolve this? We talked about how you can close the skills gap, how you can potentially engage partners that have been there, done that before, and how you can build a proper strategy so that you don't fall into this trap. You want to make sure that investing in skills and tools, while that is something that you should be doing, you have to understand that that also comes at a cost, which is why, for example, we talked enough about the skills, so I want to talk about the tools. It's important when you're purchasing tools to take multi-cloud into consideration every single time. And I want you to take that into consideration every single time, even if you don't plan on being multi-cloud. Like even if you say, hey, Eli, we are with one cloud provider. We're very happy with this cloud provider. We have no plans for multi-cloud. I would say when you're buying a tool, make sure that tool is compatible with multi-cloud. And how do you do that? Even if you're not using multi-cloud, identify the second cloud provider. So let's say you're with AWS or Azure, and you're happy with them. No plans for multi-cloud. Great. I would advise you today to identify that second cloud provider for whatever reason, because there are things outside of your control that can happen that would force multi-cloud. I'm not going to get into all of them, but a merger and acquisition is a very simple example. You could be very happy. The next day your company merges, acquires, gets acquired, bada bing, bada boom, here comes another cloud provider. When you're purchasing tools and you know that I'm buying the tool, I know it works for all the features of AWS that I want, but I've also evaluated this tool for Azure, then you avoid tool sprawl. Should you add Azure or Google or Oracle or whoever at some point, you already have a tool that works for both instead of, well, I have this monitoring tool, but it only meets all of my AWS features and only a few of the Azure features, so now I have to go buy another one, and so on and so forth. So make sure when you're making the investment, make savvy investments. Troubleshooting performance and other issues. Those are going to take time. Time is money. It goes back to skill, and it goes back to don't shy away from engaging the right partners if you feel like you've reached an impasse. Those partners, again, because they've done many of these projects before, find the right partner that has a good bench. And the secret, because I used to be, before joining Gartner, I was a consultant for a long time. When you are interviewing these consulting companies that are going to come in and help you, make sure the person that you're interviewing is the person that's doing the job. Don't let them bring the A team to close the deal and then send you folks that are going to open PDFs to try to learn what they're doing. You don't need that. That's going to be time and money as well. End user cloud adoption. If you don't have business buy-in for your cloud migration project, you're going to end up building and migrating to the cloud, but your end users, not the IT folks that we talked about earlier that are going to have the resistance to the cloud, but the end users will resist you at that point. So make sure that there's business buy-in, that everyone in the organization is aware of what's going on, that you've invested the time in training them, they know what to expect, so that they use the environment, so that you can get to that profitability sooner. Again, the quicker they start using the environment, the less money we're spending on maintaining the environment without a return on investment. 8 is governance. Now, governance is crucial, and governance could also stall an environment. It could render the user experience difficult, resistance to the environment. It could become costly. I'm going to give you examples. If you don't have the proper landing zones, that could be challenging. It could be challenging for a variety of reasons. Because if you don't have landing zones, if you didn't create the right account governance, if you don't separate your accounts properly, and you started off with too many accounts or too few accounts, you're going to create a management nightmare later on to clean up what you've created. So again, part of the strategy, part of those cloud implementation plans that the subject matter experts will create is your account governance strategy. How many accounts do you need? How many VPCs do you need? What is the criteria for creating them? What is the impact on networking? How are you going to do security? All of those things need to be part of this migration process. Because what will happen is you might be able to complete the migration. But guess what? If later on you have to come back and readdress these issues, then that's still part of the cost that you are incurring for this migration. You're cleaning up an environment that wasn't migrated to properly. Self-service capability. If you want your end users to engage, to leverage the cloud, then you have to give them the same self-service capability that they can get by going directly to Amazon or directly to Azure or Google. So you can't take away something and give them an environment that's less than what they can get without going to IT. That's what would create shadow IT and less adoption. So make sure that you have a good self-service capability in place that gives them the user experience they're looking for. And then you want automated cloud policy enforcement. We talked about this a little bit earlier. But part of doing governance is ensuring that if someone has the self-service capability that goes in and requests assets in the cloud, they shouldn't be able to generate these assets without knowing who they belong to. I mean, basic tagging at this point. You cannot create an asset. There should be a policy that prevents folks from creating assets that aren't tagged properly. Maybe it's one tag, maybe it's several tags. That's important not just for billing, but to also have a decent inventory of your assets at any point in time. Those are all things that you'll be able to use to control your costs. Because oftentimes, just like on-premises many years ago, when we started creating virtual machines and all of a sudden we had VM sprawl, I'm sure everyone will remember VM sprawl, you're going to have the same thing in the cloud. Except in the cloud, you're going to see it at the bill at the end of the month very quickly. So in order to be able to do cost optimization, I need to know who these assets belong to so that I can go ask if they still need them. Do they need them with 32 gig of memory, or can I give you 4 or 8? So being able to do inventory and assessment is going to be crucial. I did not leave data security and compliance for last. This I'm giving you 9 because it's not important. On the contrary, it's probably the most important, which is why I'm going to close with it, is data security and compliance. And here there's a lot of things, right? And again, depending on where you are in the world and the types of regulations that you're dealing with, whether you're a government entity, whether you're not, maybe you're dealing, if you're in Europe, with GDPR, maybe if you're in healthcare, you're dealing with HIPAA. Understanding the regulations, that becomes crucial in the cloud because you have to understand the process end to end. You have to understand what the implications of these requirements are on the different levels of infrastructure. Remember, you're using shared infrastructure. That means there are other tenants on there with you. What does that mean for GDPR, or what does that mean for HIPAA? Do you need to increase encryption? How are you going to deal with encryption? Who holds the keys? How are you going to do that? All of these things become crucial as part of your migration because, again, the last thing that you want to do is start a migration and then in the middle of a migration you get audited and your project falls. This is how you start to, again, increase the cost of this project. You want to be able to deal with data breaches. How are we going to deal with data breaches? Because breaches are going to happen. It's a matter of when, not if. So are we prepared? Do we have the right processes, the right tools, the right capabilities, the right skills? How are we going to deal with data breaches becomes crucial. We want to deal with standardized security across multi-cloud. Now, it's not about standardized security, but because this is the security section, so to speak, you have to do everything in a standardized way across your multi-cloud, across the on-premises environment, whether you want to call it hybrid or private cloud, and across all of your edge locations. We need to define that standardization that we're able to do because standardization reduces the surface for error. If I'm doing the same thing the same way across the board, that allows me to pay more attention to what I'm doing and hopefully not make a mistake. Now, granted, if you make a mistake, you're making it everywhere, but the idea here is that you're able to manage things in a standardized, uniform way so that it makes it easy to manage all these different environments. Understanding the shared responsibility model is crucial. It's foundational, but sometimes we tend to forget about it. You are using someone else's infrastructure. You have to understand from a security perspective what it is that they are going to do and what it is that you need to do. How, are they going to have physical security? The types of individuals that they have hired. How often do they refresh their firewalls and routers? How many times a year do they do penetration testing? All of these things are things you need to know. But on the flip side, you also need to know that on your side, you need to do two-factor authentication. You need to make sure you have the right identity and access management processes and tools that are in place. You need to figure out how you're going to unify identity and access management for SaaS and for all these different environments that you're connecting to. Security is huge, but security is also one of these hurdles that could significantly slow down or even derail a cloud migration project. So having the proper cloud implementation documents in place before you begin the migration process is going to be crucial because you're going to identify all of these things ahead of time. Your subject matter experts are going to then apply them so that we're having a smooth migration. Now, to close things out, I'm going to do a shameless plug for myself. If this type of content is something you like, I have a cloud strategy masterclass that covers all of these things in great depth on Udemy and Udemy Business. Feel free to take a look at that. I've got tons of templates and toolkits on there as well. And with that, I would love to take some questions.
Okay, great. Thanks for the great talk, Elias. Yeah, let's jump right in. And everyone, don't forget, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get through as many as we can with our remaining time. First question comes in from Lynn. How does cloud migration affect an organization's existing IT infrastructure and operations? And what changes might be required?
Yeah, I love that question. It's a question that comes up often for me with customers. So INO is front and center, and there's a couple of different ways to deal with INO. Now, there are some customers that have taken the approach of, I'm going to use the existing INO team that has been doing the data center stuff, and I'm just going to give them more cloud responsibility. That's one approach. I will tell you from experience, that particular approach fails 9 out of 10 times. For a variety of reasons. The existing team is already at capacity. They're barely able to manage the on-prem team. Now you're adding cloud responsibility to that team. It becomes a little bit of a mess. Other organizations have taken a different approach, which is to create a new team, bring in maybe 1 or 2 folks from the outside potentially that have been there, done that as far as cloud migration, and then allow the existing INO team to kind of have first dibs. If you want to move into the cloud team, you can, and they'll figure out how to backfill for them, and they'll give them the right training, responsibilities, etc. That type of an approach I've seen succeed 9 out of 10 times. Because again, you're kind of combining folks that have been there, done that, with folks that are interested, they have the same goal. That tends to work really well. I've also seen organizations that don't know how they want to restructure this yet. They don't have the internal skills, the capacity to do that. So they will use third-party, either managed services, or if you're already in a third-party contract, outsource of some sort, to help them bridge the gap, maybe even pass on skills and knowledge. And that's also worked, and there's a lot of organizations that focus on these types of managed services today. But in either case, I think if you're moving to the cloud, if you're subscribing to this idea that you're going to have multiple clouds, you're going to have the on-premises environment, and you're going to have the edge, which is basically what we're basically saying is infrastructure is going to be everywhere, then I would highly recommend that you start thinking of migrating to a platform team. Some will call it platform ops, some will call it platform engineering, some will call it, Eli, this is DevOps. I will say DevOps is not a thing, it's a culture, it's a mindset. So no, it's not DevOps, but platform ops or a platform team is a way for you to implement DevOps practices, to delineate the responsibility between IT, between your developers, and between the business, and be able to manage these environments like a cloud provider would manage. It's a different mindset, it's a different culture. It's moving away from a lot of the things we've done in INO, but that's not to say that INO doesn't have a role in it. The on-prem environment is going to remain for the foreseeable future, whether it's hybrid or private cloud. So this platform team is the right way to move forward. It's a career advancement for the existing team as well, so that's what I would recommend.
Okay, great. Let's jump to the next one. When using a multi-cloud, how do you decide what goes in which cloud?
I love that question. Yep, that's a fantastic question. So today, if you look at the cloud providers, and when I was at Gartner, we would do these comparisons and put them side by side. They pretty much look the same, right? So, I mean, AWS has ELB, Microsoft has a load balancer too. And so does Google, and VPC is VNet is VPC. You've got Direct Connect, ExpressRoute, etc. So when you look at these cloud providers on the surface, you'll find that they are very similar. However, depending on the type of application, you have to create some criteria. And in my course, I go through an entire lesson on how to choose where to put a particular workload on which cloud provider. I'll give you some quick examples. If you're looking for an application to have extreme high availability, then I would say immediately your best choice would be to put it on AWS. Why? Because AWS, historically, from day one, has architected their regions with 2 or more availability zones in every single region. All of the services in that availability zone support, all of the services in that region support availability zone type architecture, which means you can do active-active across availability zones in the same region and across regions with AWS. AWS has also been tested at scale with workloads in these regions. Now, if we look at, you say, hey, but Azure has that too, and so does Google. Let's take a look. So Azure also has regions, and they do have availability zones. Not all Azure regions have availability zones. And not all the regions that have availability zones, all of the services in that region might not support availability zones. So then there's discrepancy. You have to figure out which Azure region you're deploying in. Does it have availability zones? Are the services that I want to use supported? So that becomes a question to ask. You move on to Google. Google, like AWS, also has availability zones from day one. Every one of the regions has AZs, 3 or more. But what we've noticed is some of the availability zones with Google are not as far apart as we would like them to be. So for example, with AWS, we know that each availability zone is at least a mile apart. With Google, they could be on the same floor, separated by drywall, or in the same building, separated by floors. So those things become criteria for whether or not it is acceptable for you to move to one of these cloud providers. And I can give you several other examples that we can go in. For example, if you're looking for hybrid, I would say AWS does a good job, but Microsoft Azure truly does hybrid really, really well. Why? Because they've taken a position on every single piece of software that they have is going to be hybrid, whether it's SQL Server with stretch clusters, whether it's Windows Server, whether it's Visual Studio, whether you have Azure Stack, Arc. I mean, I could go on for a while. You say multi-cloud, I'll say Azure again, right? Microsoft has good relationships with Oracle, where they're interconnecting their regions, region to region, low bandwidth, high connectivity between them. That means if you're looking for multi-cloud, that's a great partnership to have. Use Oracle workloads on Oracle Cloud, everything else on Microsoft, bada bing, bada boom, win-win. And you can do the same thing. Google has a similar approach. So there's different criteria that you can use to figure out, well, I'm going to put this workload here, but not there. We can talk about high-performance compute and spot instances. There's a ton of criteria. While they all look the same, and in most cases, you can probably get away with any workload on any cloud. But if you really want to figure out where to put which, there is criteria to help you do that.
Okay, great. Let's get 1 or 2 more questions in here before the top of the hour. Here's a clarification question on something you spoke to earlier. Can you please speak to calculating the speed of cost formula? Is there one that can reliably inform the org trying to adopt cloud in their environment?
Can you repeat that question again?
Sure. Can you please speak to the calculating of the speed of cost formula?
The speed of cost. Not sure I understand the question entirely, but if you're talking about how quickly, cost starts to add up, I don't have a specific formula for that, but I will say that as part of migrating to the cloud, a lot of folks will say, well, the cloud's more expensive, and as a result, we shouldn't move to the cloud, we should stay on-prem. No matter what method or formula you use, I will tell you right now, in the short term, you are incurring additional costs because you're moving from one environment to another, but you're not getting rid of the environment you're moving from. You're shrinking your on-premises environment. You're moving some workloads out, but that thing is never going to go away. So when you take a step back and try to compare them, you now have added something. So no matter what formula you use, the cloud is an additional cost, which is why I say when you're moving to cloud, instead of focusing just on cost, focus on how you can get business buy-in, how the business believes that cloud becomes a competitive advantage, because at that point, you're getting out of the business of being a cost center and into the business of being a revenue-generating part of the business. That's what I would recommend. Hopefully, I got the question right.
Yeah, I hopefully too. With that, though, we are out of time for questions. So thanks again, Elias, for the great talk.
Thank you.